I think it's fitting that our wrap-up speaker is Bob Hormats. He's Undersecretary of State for Economic Affairs. He's got a global remit in terms of his responsibilities. As recently as last night, he and I spent a dinner together talking about some of the Middle East problems, and particularly Egypt. But he's worked very extensively on Russia, expanding the U.S.-Russia economic relationship, and planning for this next big step that's been the focus today, Russia's accession to the WTO, PNTR legislation, and all that. Bob Hormats has an enormously rich career in government, in the private sector, as an author. He's written excellent books on the U.S. role in the world economy and U.S. economic policy. In previous incarnations, he's been the senior economic advisor at the National Security Council, Assistant Secretary of State, Deputy USTR, and now Undersecretary of State for Economic Affairs. He spent an extended period at Goldman Sachs between his previous government stint and now, so he's got rich experience in the private sector as well. He and I have been close personal friends for almost 40 years, so it's a particular pleasure, Bob, to welcome you back to our podium to wrap up our event on the U.S.-Russia economic relationship. Great to see you.
Thank you very much, Fred, for that kind introduction. As Fred said, we've been friends for over 40 years, and Fred gave me my first job in Washington years ago on the National Security Council staff, and we have been close friends ever since. He's been not only a friend, but a mentor and someone who I've just enjoyed working with on a personal, professional basis for a very long time, and it continues still, so that's very nice. I think it's useful today. I know you've had a long day, so I will try not to duplicate too much of what was said before, but I think it's useful to bring the U.S.-Russian relationship back into both a bilateral and a multilateral or global context. I want to say a few words on the issue of WTO accession and the question of Jackson-Vanik graduation. Without doubt, the question of the WTO relationship with Russia and Russian accession has been the primary focus of U.S. economic policy vis-a-vis Russia over the last year and a half. And we hope it's an area where we're nearing the finish line, or Russia is nearing the finish line. Russia, of course, as we all know, is not a static place. Things are changing. All the experts gathered here today have followed the ins and outs and ups and downs of the Russia-WTO question, and I will try to shed a little light on where we are now. I think it's useful as a starting point to recognize that there have been and continue to be numerous positive changes taking place in Russia, changes that will benefit not only the Russian people themselves, but also Russia as a participant in the global economy. Others, particularly in Congress, I think would benefit from being updated on a fairly regular basis about the trends that are taking place in Russia. It's very easy to see Russia through an old prism, or in some cases, in a prism that's maybe goes back to the Cold War, but it's now important to see it through a new prism, a fresh prism, and a prism that is based on the fact that numerous changes, as I say, have occurred in Russia and continue to occur in Russia. And this is a place where a lot of change is underway and is going to continue. So updating the American public, and particularly updating Congress on these changes, is a very good idea. Russia is not likely to become the manufacturing powerhouse that China is, but there are other avenues to growth, and I'm sure many of these have been discussed, and I'm sure Anders and others have talked about them. The Russian government, after experiencing the serious effects of the global crisis of 2008, has accepted, I think, in many cases quite robustly, the notion that modernization, innovation, and diversification of the economy are keys to future economic growth. Even the most conservative in the Russian elite now realize that the country's dependence on commodity exports and large foreign exchange reserves will not insulate them from turbulence in the global economy. This realization presents an important opportunity for Russia. President Medvedev and his team have set the goals of modernizing the economy in 5 important sectors: energy efficiency, nuclear technology, information technology, space, and the production of certain pharmaceutical products. The U.S. is working in partnership with Russia on its integration into the global economy in many ways. First, Russia's WTO accession is on a positive track in Geneva and in bilateral conversations that we have had as well. And Jackson Vanik graduation and the granting of PNTR are a legislative priority for this administration, the White House, the State Department, and other aspects of this administration as well. Second, we're also very supportive of the process of Russian accession to the OECD, with important steps on the way to accession. For instance, the hope for signing by the Russians of the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention. It's had its first reading in the Duma. There's a good chance it will have its second reading very soon, and our hope is that by the time of the OECD Ministerial, there'll be an opportunity for a very important ceremony that marks the signing of this. This would be a major step in the right direction, a step that would be hard to have contemplated 5 or 6 years ago, or even maybe 2 or 3 years ago. There's also informal conversations about a bilateral investment treaty. This is not going to happen right away, but we've been talking about investment for some time, and we're trying to get our model bit through the process of decision-making in Washington, but that's something to look forward to over the medium term. And then there is intensified focus on innovation, utilizing the bilateral presidential commission and the working groups that have been created under that. And that's another area where we're working together. There's also new announcements of partnerships between Russian and U.S. companies, such as Aeroflot's recent decision to purchase 8 Boeing 777s, which will support thousands of jobs in the United States and Russia. And there's a great deal of cooperation in science and technology in areas such as energy, health, the environment, as well as a revived Innovation Council on high technologies that will focus on the commercialization of research and development. And there's over $1 billion committed by American companies to Skolkovo, and I'm sure you've heard something about this, but a lot of big companies are involved in this or engaged in this. Craig Barrett, the former chairman of Intel, is one of the leaders in this process. So you've got some very talented people. We're also, of course, working very closely with Russia in the G8. I'm the Foreign Affairs Sherpa of the G8. We meet frequently, and Russia is represented there. And of course, Russia is fully represented in the Group of 20 as well. So the integration of Russia into the global economic system, into the institutions of that system, has been taking place at a very rapid rate, and the sense of engagement between American and Russian officials on a wide variety of issues, from finance to trade to technology to the environment, is far greater than it was 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. And when you take the progress it's made since the end of the Cold War in the U.S. and Russia working together in multilateral fora, including those institutions, the World Bank and the IMF and many others, it's quite a remarkable achievement in intensified institutional cooperation. But while Russia attempts to modernize, it's fair to say that state-owned or state-supported companies continue to play a very dominant role in many aspects of the Russian economy and are very prominent on the Russian economic landscape. And this could be a problem if the playing field is not level between these companies and their competitors. There is increasing realization by the Russian government that this heavy statist model may not deliver the productivity gains needed to allow Russia to compete effectively in the global economy. As President Medvedev noted in his 2009 speech entitled Go Russia. The question is, will it be different this time? Will Russia, in this era of intense global competition, be able to diversify, compete, and to prosper and move away from the heavy statist model and heavy dependence on raw materials, oil, gas, and other things? Despite the state dominance in the economy, however, I'm encouraged by the overall policy direction coming from Moscow and the conversations I've had with Russian officials as late as Fred has mentioned, as a couple of weeks ago, where I had a chance to meet with Kudrin, who has done a tremendous job as finance minister, Mrs. Nabulina, who is in charge of economic development, trade, and a number of other things, and of course, a number of the people in the Foreign Office and in the presidency, all of whom are very heavily focused on the modernization of the Russian economy and the diversification of the Russian economy. Even in the last several weeks, we've seen policy changes that, if implemented, would help to unleash Russia's entrepreneurial power. But it's also fair to say that many potential challenges still stand in the way. Russia is close to meeting the global high-level standards of the premier institutions such as the WTO and the OECD, which will support further developments in this direction. But the progress needs to continue in order for the criteria of the WTO and the OECD to be met. As I mentioned earlier, the progress is evident in a certain number of areas and very visible. One is the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention. By the time of the OECD meeting, we hope that it will be ready and it can be signed. And that would provide a number of other things that are helpful, both internally in Russia and externally, in providing needed credibility to Russia's accession campaign, but it will also strengthen the efforts that the Russian government is making internally to deal with anti-corruption, its anti-corruption agenda. One of the main pillars of the global economy, the WTO, which I will focus on now, has been a critical objective of Russia and a number of Russian leaders for the last several years. And as I mentioned, these negotiations have had their ups and downs, but a lot of progress has been and I think continues to be made. It's important to realize how important the WTO is, not just to Russia, but to the global system, and why Russian accession to it is so important, not just for Russia, but to the world. For the most part, during the financial crisis, the WTO proved its strength and its indispensability in avoiding the kind of crisis that we've seen in the past during downturns. For instance, the late 1920s, early 1930s, where there was no WTO, there was no international trade organization at all, and countries reverted to beggar-thy-neighbor types of policies. Now, during the recent crisis, 2008, 2009, in particular, most members maintained their obligations to keep their markets open despite domestic pressures to take short-sighted protectionist steps that could have exacerbated the downturn. As the global economy begins to grow and trade flows begins to pick up again, it's significant that Russia has renewed its efforts to join the WTO, because the more countries that are willing to engage in the WTO and adhere to its rules-based system, the stronger the global trading system will be. As President Obama and President Medvedev said during their meeting here in Washington in June 2010, Russia's accession to the WTO is a top policy priority for both countries. Vice President Biden reiterated our desire to see Russia in the WTO when he visited Russia just last month. The United States fully supports Russia's aspiration to join the WTO, and we've made our most experienced trade experts available to work with Russia in these negotiations. Russia has made enormous strides toward completing the accession process since President Medvedev's visit to Washington. It's encouraging to hear statements from Russian leaders, such as President Medvedev's hope that the process will be completed this year. Ultimately, the pace of completing the final steps depends on Russia's determination, its creativity, and its flexibility. The Russian government wouldn't be pursuing WTO accession if it was not seen by Russian leaders to be in Russia's best interest. As Russia looks to attract, thanks very much. Been speaking too much last week. As Russia looks to attract foreign investment, prevent capital flight, and promote innovation in a globalized economy, Moscow sees the need to offer businesses the certainty that it will abide by the same rules of the road in trade that now apply to 95% of the world's economy. Nearly every country in the world, excepting perhaps North Korea, seeks capital and innovation. Russian leaders know that they must offer competitive conditions and play by global rules in order to attract more investment and more diversified investment. The stability of faithful WTO compliance, while not a panacea, is a very important consideration for the international business community to demonstrate that Russia is playing by these global rules and to enable Russia to be more attractive to the kind of investment that it needs for its modernization process. Russia's accession to the WTO would also bring new opportunities for U.S. exporters and U.S. workers. The United States government has set the goal of doubling our exports by 2015. Reducing trade barriers around the world is an important element in our strategy to reduce that goal. As you've, I'm sure, heard today, the U.S. companies need to take full advantage of WTO's accession, Russia's WTO accession, if that were to occur. And in order for them to do that, Congress will need first to grant the President the authority to extend permanent normal trade relations to Russia. Before taking such a momentous vote, however, among other things, Congress will want to see that U.S. farmers, ranchers, service providers, and manufacturers can sell to Russia without facing anti-competitive restrictions. Congress will also look to see whether Russia follows the passage of WTO-consistent legislation with movements on intellectual property rights and robust enforcement of intellectual property rights. This is an area that the Congress has been focusing on to a very substantial degree. As President Obama has affirmed, the administration will work with Congress this year to try to terminate Jackson-Vanik restrictions and extend permanent normal trade relations for Russia. As Trade Representative Kirk has mentioned, we're considering the timing in the context of a comprehensive trade agenda this year as we seek the next steps forward on other trade agreements such as those with Korea, Colombia, and Panama, and renewal of trade adjustment assistance and our generalized preferences. So we have a wide range of issues in the Congress, and how we fit Jackson-Vanik in and when we fit it in is going to take a number of consultations with the Hill, but the overall commitment is there to do it. The timing has to be worked out in the context of other items on our broader trade agenda. Let me now turn briefly to the question of innovation and modernization, which is part of the Russian agenda, and it's also part of American cooperation with Russia. Russia's entry into WTO will not, as I mentioned earlier, be the panacea for its quest for economic modernization, but arguably it will provide a much-needed boost in terms of the credibility of its commitment to competing in the global economy on the basis of international rules and improvements in the rule of law at home. Equally important, however, will be continuation of reforms that will address Russia's competitiveness and its innovation challenges. Here, too, we think a robust partnership between the United States and Russia would be beneficial to both sides. I expect to be leading a steering group with President Medvedev's economic advisor, Arkady Dvorkovich, to help sort through the range of bilateral activities we have on this front and decide how best to assist, in particular, developments in Skolkovo in the first instance. And we're going to focus our collaboration on Skolkovo largely because the Russians see this as an important priority for them, but also because success there can provide demonstration effects for other kinds of collaboration between Russian companies and American companies. Developing an innovation culture is something that the United States does very well. Many countries, including developed countries, are looking for ways to do better in order to compete in the fast-paced global economy. Here, too, I see opportunities as well as challenges in the Russian context. An opportunity, as the issue of economic modernization is finally front and center on the Russian government's agenda, and this does present an opportunity for collaboration between our two countries. We've seen concrete evidence of the government's commitment to do this over the past several years. But there are also challenges because this process is taking place against a backdrop of heavy state involvement in the economy, which by its nature tends to bestow benefits on state-owned or state-supported industries, often to the detriment of other competitors, both foreign and domestic. And Russia does not have the luxury or the time or the unlimited financial resources to devote to having only the government decide what constitutes a competitive industry. It needs a competitive environment in order to do that. Nor, as with other countries, does it have monopoly on wisdom and prescience in determining which industries are likely to be the most competitive ones in the future. Competition within Russia and competition in the global system are the best ways of doing that. But it is not, of course, for us to say what system is right for Russia. What we have been advocating globally is a system of what we call competitive neutrality. In countries with industries or companies that receive heavy state support via preferential tax or financial or regulatory treatment or enjoy privileged market access. Work has been going on in the OECD on these competitive neutrality principles, which in essence are mutually reinforcing policy recommendations involving trade, investment, competition, corporate governance policies to ensure a level playing field for all competitors, both domestic and foreign. It's important that non-SOEs or state-supported enterprises and other companies that are competing in the Russian environment and indeed in the global environment as well are not stifled or discriminated against de jure or de facto. And the key point here is that even governments that want to have a role in their economies through support for state enterprises or ownership of state enterprises need to find a way of ensuring that by doing so, they do not create an unlevel playing field that supports those enterprises vis-a-vis private sector or other enterprises in their own country or internationally. A level playing field is important as Russia seeks foreign direct investment for its modernization and infrastructure needs. Investment is not going to come in if it believes that the playing field in Russia is tilted in favor of state enterprises or state-supported enterprises against foreign enterprises that want to or are contemplating investing in Russia itself. There's likely to be a significant state sector in Russia or state influence in Russia for some time. But within that framework, or whatever framework Russia chooses, we still need a strategic package of policy reforms to ensure that there is fair competition, that entrepreneurship can flourish, and that job creation has an opportunity to blossom in sectors that are not dominated or heavily influenced by the state. The environment also needs to be one that encourages risk-taking and allows for both success and failure. The ability of the government to pick winners and protect companies against the prospects of failure also dulls the process of creative entrepreneurialism that exists in other countries and ultimately leads to greater dynamism and growth in their economies. There also needs to be strong support for the protection of intellectual property, transparency, and accountability to allow Russia to fully unleash its own competitive strengths internally in Russia. I'm very encouraged that President Medvedev signed on April 2nd a list of orders setting concrete deadlines for implementation of 10 measures aimed at improving Russia's investment climate. We found that a key component for economic modernization is confidence in a robust and transparent rule of law and credible government institutions. Vice President Biden made this point quite clearly in his speech at Moscow State University, noting that political and economic modernization go hand in hand, and that institutional changes to support democracy and rule of law still need to be focused on as Russia continues to evolve. And those who benefit from the current system, who see protectionism in agriculture with grain tariffs and non-tariff barriers to protect domestic production, or onerous or anti-WTO compliant investment measures in areas such as automobiles, encourage people to stick to their old perceptions that Russia cannot change. Our view is that Russia can change, and Russia is changing, but there's still a lot of baggage from the past that has to be dealt with in order to make that change fully complete and fully credible, and to move on with the modernization process. However, even if the government is not reforming as fast or as far as some would like on the Russian side or the American side, real progress has been made. And I think that's the final point that I want to leave with you, and that is that we're seeing in Russia a phenomenon that is very interesting. There are private sector entrepreneurs, both Russian and foreign, working in many sectors to develop new ideas, new businesses, using cross-border collaborative models that are key to the innovation process. And this is cause for great hope. You see American scientists and Russian scientists working together on such things as nuclear fusion, on automobile technology, on pharmaceutical innovations. A whole range of new technological cooperation measures are taking place between scientists and engineers and innovators in Russia, in the United States, and many other parts of the world. And this then is the challenge for us as well as for Russia. The challenge for us and for Russia is to break out of old stereotypes, take a critical look at factual developments on the ground, some good, some bad, and to work to improve our collaboration and take full advantage of our economic partnership. There'll always be naysayers, and certainly there continue to be great challenges for Russia in improving its economy and enhancing its transformation. But there is every reason to believe that the work that we've been doing with Russia has been, first of all, mutually beneficial for both societies, and also has helped to contribute to the modernization process that many Russian leaders now are focusing on and are devoting a lot of their political energies to. And there's also every reason to be encouraged by these developments. Russia is a country that, if you look at the broad sweep of history, Russia needs to and has every reason to want to play a greater role in the global economic system. It has been doing this in the G20, the G8, in the IMF and the World Bank, and by completing the final efforts to become part of the WTO and completing the final measures that will ultimately, we hope, enable it to become part of the OECD, it will further become a key element in the global economic system. And as I said at the outset, the key to the 21st century is to have the major economic players at the table in helping to shape the global economy as it evolves over the next 10, 15, 20, 25 years. And to do that, you really need all the major economies to participate. You need all the major economies to have a vested interest in the success of the global economic system, and having Russia at the table to play a role in shaping the global economy of the future is critically important to the global economy. And the more Russia does this, the more we think it can help not only strengthen the global economy, but as it becomes more integrated, as it becomes more a part of the rules-based global economic system, it will enhance changes taking place in Russia, which will enable Russia to undertake the kind of modernization that its leaders want on the basis of a rules-based system and on the basis of collaboration with others in the global economy and participating in the global economic system to a degree that perhaps would not have been envisaged 10 or 15 years ago, but today can enhance the Russian reform process at home and strengthen the global economic process internationally. Thank you very much.
Bob, thank you very much. You've made a number of very thoughtful comments about the Russian economy, the Russian role in the world. We've got a lot of experts in the room on those topics. I'm not one. So let me open it up and see what questions colleagues, participants in the conference would like to put to you by way of wrapping up our final session here. Sergei Guryev, you may know, runs the New Economic School in Moscow. They've been our co-host of this conference, and Sergei gave a wonderful presentation this morning. So we give him pride of place.
Thank you. Thank you for these insightful comments. My question is regarding OECD accession. Today we talked mostly about WTO, but I think OECD accession is very, very important too. Could you elaborate on what are the issues that are remaining, what are the problems, and indeed what is the roadmap to the accession?
Well, first of all, the sequence normally, in fact, in every case so far, has been that a country joins the WTO and can only get in the OECD if it joins the WTO. So a lot of what it needs to do to join the OECD will have been dealt with if it does, in fact, join the WTO, as we hope it will when all the final details are worked out. The second point is that there are a lot of subgroups of the WTO that deal with intellectual property protection, deal with transparency, deal with a wide range of labor issues. There are 12, 13, 14 subcommittees of the OECD, and countries, in order to join the OECD, have to comply with the various codes and provisions of these groups. Russia has worked very hard on some of these groups. It has not been as enthusiastic a participant in some of the others. And we've had conversations with the Russian government to explain that it really needs to engage itself fully in all of these committees and the work of all these committees in order to comply with their obligations. And once that's done, intellectual property is an example, for instance. And the OECD has added a number of emerging economies, but in many cases, the last holdup has been intellectual property compliance, which from an American point of view, as well as from the point of view of other trading partners, is very important. So it has to go through each of these committees as sort of a screening process, and if it does that, then there's a vote of the membership of the OECD, and then presumably if it does everything it needs to do, it would be able to join. The advantage of the OECD is that that even before Russia joins, there are many things it can do to work within the context of the OECD well before joining. For instance, as I mentioned, the Anti-Bribery Convention. There are lots of things, there are lots of these committees in which Russia can play a role, not as full members, but as providing a forum for exchanging information, exchanging ideas, and developing a common outlook on financial issues, on economic issues, on agricultural issues, on a wide range of things. So we welcome, and the OECD in fact has an outreach program where they have been working very closely with Russia on a wide range of issues. Even without Russia joining the OECD, there's been a lot of collaboration with the OECD. And we think 10 years ago there was a lot of concern among Chinese and Russians and other countries who were not part of the OECD that this was sort of a Western, American-led or European-centered institution. Now, with the addition of a number of emerging economies, it's not just a European or American institution. It's done, excuse me. It includes a lot of people from other countries and other parts of the world. Chile, Israel is a member. The head of the OECD is a former finance minister and foreign minister of Mexico. So we invite other countries to participate in the deliberations of the various committees of the OECD, and we think it's sort of mutually beneficial for Russia to play a greater and greater role in the process, even before it becomes a full member.
Bob, a sidebar on that. Part of the OECD framework of institutions is the International Energy Agency, the IEA.
Right.
Is it envisaged that Russia will become a member of the IEA?
I think if Russia becomes a member of the OECD, there's no reason why it shouldn't be a member of the IEA. We have been very eager to have the IEA do a similar kind of outreach. And in fact, the IEA collaborates with a lot of countries around the world that are not members but are big oil producers. And as I'm sure people in the audience know, Russia is the biggest oil producer in the world. It's not the biggest oil exporter, but it is the biggest oil producer. So, and it's producing other kinds of energy as well, obviously gas. So we, exchanging ideas, exchanging information with the OECD, even now, is something that could be beneficial to the Russians and beneficial to other members of the IEA. So we encourage OECD outreach, IEA outreach, better exchange of information on the energy situation, particularly given the energy circumstances we find ourselves in today, would be a plus for Russia and for...
Well, so I thought it was particularly interesting because the IEA, and you were involved in its startup a long time ago, was initially the anti-OPEC consumers
Right.
cartel to try to cope with the producers cartel. As you say, it's evolved over time, but to have Russia come in to the IEA, I think would be very interesting, very constructive, and including for Russia itself. So
Yeah.
I think that's a very interesting innovation and a good institutional base for maybe some new forms of collaboration.
Yeah, and I think you put your finger on it, Fred. The one, if you look back, and I mentioned this very briefly in my comments, if you look back at why the world was able to weather this financial crisis far better than it did in the 20s and 30s, it was because there were robust institutions and patterns of cooperation and norms and rules that most countries adhered to. And a lot of countries were engaged in the process. They had a vested interest in the institutions and the system. You know, picture a counterfactual history. Suppose we'd had this crisis with no IMF, with no World Bank, and with no WTO.
And no G20.
And no G20, how much worse it would have been. But you had these patterns of cooperation, these norms, these sets of rules that had been established over a number of years whereby countries worked together. And while Russia wasn't in the WTO, it was in all the others. And therefore it provided a collaborative forum. So strong international institutions with strong rules and credible, legitimately, widely accepted rules is really an extremely important part of the success of the global economy, and one of the reasons it proved a lot more resilient than many people thought, certainly compared to what happened in the last major financial crisis in the 20s.
Well, and just to reinforce that, I mean, the post-war system was, of course, created to avoid replicating what happened in the interwar period.
Right.
I have really viewed this crisis period as the first real stress test for the Bretton Woods system and this network of institutions we have. And as you say, it's come through with pretty flying colors.
Yeah.
I mean, there have been a few dents, and we're not totally through it yet, but this was, I think, the first real stress test for the system across the board, and the response is quite a testimony to what's been built and you guys for maintaining it through this crisis period.
And in fact, what's interesting about it is that leaders within countries use the fact that they're committed to global rules to resist nationalistic pressures internally. And therefore, a strong global system is not just about a global economy, it's about enabling responsible people in individual countries to press against people who want to take nationalistic or other kinds of extreme actions that would hurt their own economy and the global economy. So it acts as a counterweight against irresponsible domestic measures.
A very good example of that, our Russian friends may not know about it, in the very first days of the Obama administration, when the fiscal stimulus package was being run quickly through the Congress. Very protectionist Buy America provisions were included in the initial version of that legislation as passed by the House. And then with some help from the outside,
like Fred,
the administration took a very strong line against that continuing in the Senate version of the final legislation, including, importantly, on the grounds that it would violate U.S. obligations in the WTO. And that's a very good example of what Bob said. It was a new administration, a new Congress, particularly in a Congress. They didn't know about these international obligations. They might have ignored them anyway. But the administration used it very effectively and successfully to avoid at least the worst of what could have come out.
Yeah.
And that was early days in the crisis, new U.S. administration. If that had gone the wrong way, that could have not only been bad for the U.S., it could have triggered emulation in a lot of other countries' stimulus programs that could have set a protectionist spiral in way. So even though things like that don't get maybe as much public attention as they deserve, it really is an extremely important illustration of what Bob was saying. Question over here.
Jan Kalitsky. Bob, I'm glad you also mentioned bilateral investment treaty. And as you know, in the early 90s, in fact, there was a BIT concluded. It was signed by both sides, in fact, ratified by the Senate. Now we're looking for a model BIT at this point, which is an improved version, if you will, of the BIT. But I wonder what your thoughts are about trying to move forward and maybe accelerate our progress towards that goal, given the fact that the U.S. has plenty of BITs with other countries, not Russia. Russia has plenty of BITs with other countries, but not the United States.
Well, this has been a somewhat complicated issue, if I may use that word. There are differing perspectives, views on this issue in the Congress. And while the model BIT does not require congressional approval, it would be, I think, it would complicate the negotiating process with other countries if it did not have at least a relatively strong base of support in the Congress before we go out and start negotiating new agreements. So what we're trying to do, and other countries would not regard us as credibly if we did not have that kind of backup compared to the way they regard us if we did. So we're trying to proceed as carefully as we can to pull together enough of a consensus in the Congress to begin the negotiating process in a way that's credible at home and credible to our trading partners, our economic partners. And we're not quite there yet. There's a lot of conversations. A lot of conversations have gone on. They're doubtless going to continue. I can't give you a time frame because I just don't know what it would be. But it's something that we understand the need for good bilateral investment treaties because, as you correctly point out, a lot of countries have them, a lot of countries are negotiating them. And one of the things important is a good bilateral investment treaty is also important to exports because in many cases, not every case, but in many cases, the presence of a company in another country that has full rights of bilateral investment protection is a way of enhancing exports to that country. Boeing is a good example of this. Boeing, I mentioned this Boeing sale of 777s. One of the reasons and this was, Putin mentioned this in fact, was that Russia bought Boeings in addition to there being terrific airplanes, is that Boeing had a research facility in Russia. In many cases, they employed 1,500 people. In many cases, the ability of an American company to sell in a foreign country depends, at least in part, on their having some kind of presence there. And for them to feel comfortable in having a presence, they need certain rights and privileges that come, essentially equality, that come from having a bilateral investment treaty to protect their interests. So we know the business community would like this, and we also think it could be helpful to at least some companies in their ability to do business in these countries and export to them, but we still need to do some work on the Hill.
Yes.
I'm Jack Brocker from the Commerce Department. This morning, Deputy Prime Minister Kudrin mentioned the announced plans to sell publicly minority shares in some state-owned companies and majority shares in some state-owned companies. And I wondered, based on your experience in the financial world, whether you have any thoughts on how they can be successful in going forward.
Well, in my earlier job, I would have probably been able to give you an answer to that. But
I'd probably make some money from doing it.
that's right. That's right. That would have been my goal. But in the current environment, I think that obviously how well you do in any particular transaction depends on the quality of the company, its corporate governance, its business prospects. So it's hard to isolate this and make some generic comment on the broad element of it. I do think that the fact that companies go public in many cases, not all of them, and sell shares abroad is really part of the kind of discipline, if I can use that word, that Fred and I were talking about earlier, and that is to sell shares in the United States, you have to comply with certain SEC standards. You have to have accounting by a major accounting firm. You have to have a lot of transparency in order to get through the registration process and the financial analysts and the rating agencies. So and the accountants. It depends what kind of asset you're selling, but certainly the accountants. So the fact that a company wants to, or the Russian government will encourage or allow a company to sell its assets in a foreign market, whether it's the United States or in Europe or somewhere else, means that it helps. The very fact of doing this feeds back positively in most cases, not every case, there are examples where it doesn't, but in most cases helps to improve corporate governance of that particular company. It also helps to improve the corporate regulatory process in the country itself, because the more companies that are listed and have to comply with global, let's say global accounting standards or global registration standards, then there are pressures within the individual country to improve the standards internally to raise them up to higher global standards. And investors are very reluctant to invest in a company where the host country has poor regulatory standards or poor disclosure standards or poor transparency. So the fact of registration and selling abroad tends not only to improve the corporate governance of a company, but also over time, not right away, but over time, tends to force governments in that country to improve their regulatory and transparency performance as well.
Bob, we thank you enormously. We've reached our witching hour to bring the conference to a close.